LBC. Call Clegg. Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg takes your calls with Nick Ferrari at breakfast. 0845 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Leading Britain's conversation. This is Call Clegg on LBC.
It's 9 o'clock on Thursday, the 6th of March, and that means it's time for Call Clegg with me, Nick Clegg, here on LBC. So I'll be taking your questions for the next half an hour. Do call on 0845 6060 973 or email at nickclegg@lbc.co.uk. And of course, you can watch on the website lbc.co.uk. So let's go straight to the first caller, who is Nikki in Islington. Hello, Nikki.
Hi, Nick. You okay?
Yes, I am. How are you?
Good. I'm fine, thank you. Nick, I was calling because I heard a leaked conversation between the US Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and the
So I
US
can't hear you very well, Nikki. Say it again.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Yep. That's fine. I said I heard a leaked conversation between the US Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and the Ambassador to Ukraine, Mr. Jeffrey Pryor. Are you aware of the conversation?
No, I'm not.
And your line is, this is Nick Ferrari, your line is dipping in and out. We're really going to have to ask you to shout. You somehow have heard this leaked conversation.
Absolutely. It's since been acknowledged by Washington. It's really concerning that Mr. Clegg is aware of it. But just to enlighten you all then, Mrs. Nuland clearly displayed a heavy involvement in restructuring of the Ukrainian government. And Mr. Pryor and Nuland discussed which of the three opposition leaders they want to take power and which of the ones they want to keep out. And as if this wasn't controversial enough, Mr. Clegg, Mrs. Nuland is quoted as responding to Pryor with the comment, F you. She just wasn't so nice about that.
All right. I'm going to intervene here. I've got to ask you to either move to a question. Mr. Clegg, I've not heard of it.
No,
Neither
I know what Nicky's talking about.
You do know where we're going.
It was a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
so what is the question?
So what's the question, Nicky?
How do you feel about the comments made, the heavy involvement by America, and the fact that this story's been covered in Britain? It hasn't been covered widely at all. And it's another sign of the media manipulating the story, regardless of its severity. And it's quite concerning that Mr. Clegg isn't aware of this leaked conversation.
Well, I'm just Nicky, sorry, I think with slight cross purposes, I did actually hear about it. I think I now know what you're alluding to. It was a couple of weeks ago. It was all over the national media. I heard it on the radio myself. This was a reported telephone conversation, between two US diplomats. The US diplomats will have to talk for themselves. I think if what you're implying is that there was some sort of sinister American plot to run Ukrainian politics, I just can't disagree more about, to suggest in any way there was something inauthentic about those protesters protesting and dying on the streets of Kiev. I mean, this wasn't just some game. This wasn't just some put-up job by some faceless US diplomats, if that's what you're implying, Nicky, which, if you are implying, it's an absurd thing to imply. This was a sincerely heartfelt view of many Ukrainians that they wanted their country to have closer links with Europe and didn't just want to be, if you like, in the orbit of Russian influence. Now, that's the great identity crisis, if you like, at the heart of the conflict in Ukraine, and it is incredibly important that we all say unambiguously to the Russians that they should leave this debate to the Ukrainian people. It shouldn't be determined in Moscow. But I think if what you're suggesting from that leaked conversation, Nicky, that I don't know, Washington was pulling the strings. I really think that is just doing a massive disservice to those very brave Ukrainian protesters who protested, demonstrated, and some of them died for their very sincerely held beliefs.
Deputy Prime Minister, while we're on this subject, how close do you think we got? How near did we inch to some form of the resumption of the Cold War this week?
Well, I think Putin is displaying sort of Cold War reflexes, which are just totally out of step with modern Europe, and his mindset, if you like, seems to me to be very much a throwback to Cold War thinking. He regards any closer contact between Ukraine and the European Union as something synonymous with the kind of old style ideological conflict between communism and capitalism. It isn't. It is just. This is why I think is where I think he's got it so very, very wrong. Ukraine can develop closer links with the European Union, which is not a military organisation. It's just the world's largest borderless single market, and it will be a good thing for the people of Ukraine and a good thing for people of Europe if we can trade and develop each other's prosperity more over time. There's nothing incompatible with that, with also many Ukrainians, including Russian-speaking Ukrainians, maintaining a very strong sense of affiliation with people in Russia, and to see it always as a zero-sum game. That, there is these sort of rigid boundaries on the map, and they have to be fiercely protected one way or the other, I think is a throwback to a past which I'd hoped Europe had gone beyond.
And lastly, it's reported today the Prime Minister could be authorising as much as £1 billion as part of an EU financial package, which could total somewhere in the region of £9 billion. Is that money well spent?
Well, remember, this is not some new £1 billion package that we've unilaterally announced. In fact, I think William Hague has announced a £10 million technical assistance programme for Ukraine. But there is, of course, UK money in the IMF and the European Union, which, depending on the outcome of the summit, which the Prime Minister is attending today in Brussels,
a lot of money, isn't it, Mr.
Well,
Clegg?
let's see what they announce. But I don't think we should. I don't think we should be under any illusions. It is in our interests to have a stable rather than unstable Ukraine. It is in our interests to have a prosperous rather than impoverished Ukraine, because if Ukraine is in a sense brought to its knees economically and socially, never mind what the military incursions are from Russia, we'll end up, frankly, paying a much higher cost in the years to come.
And at the same time, it's reported the army cuts are risking national security. Wouldn't the £1 billion be better spent there, Mr. Clegg?
Well, as I say, and we've talked about this before, it's not an either-or. It's not an either-or. Okay. We have to pay our way as a country, but we also have to play our role, particularly in our own European backyard, to make sure that our own European backyard remains stable. If it doesn't, if this becomes
an army,
well, if this leads to a sort of chain reaction of greater instability in that part of Europe, I can guarantee you in some months or years to come, you and I will be discussing here about much, much bigger sacrifices we'd have to make in order to try and stabilise that part of Europe, because the consequences in terms of the mass movement of people across borders, in terms of loss of jobs across the European continent, are very significant.
All right, let's move on to other calls.
Joe in Tunbridge Wells. Hello, Joe.
Hello, good morning, Mr. Clegg.
Morning.
Let me say that I've studied the Europe issue, and I am convinced that this country will be diminished politically and economically should it leave the EU. But, however, I think that Nigel Farage is offering a simple blame the foreigner populist message that a notable number of people want to hear, regardless of the logic and the facts. Mm-hmm. On the other hand...
Moving to your question, if I may, Joe, I'm sure the Deputy Prime Minister is enjoying the support, but let's move you to your question.
Just slightly alarmed so that we have a third Nick.
Yes.
You, on the other hand, Nick, have taken on the brave challenge of communicating a complex truth that goes contrary to what those same people want to hear. Do you feel confident about taking on this challenge?
Well, thank you for making my job sound so easy.
What a build-up, Mr.
But Joe, I disagree with you on one point. I think we, by the sounds of it, Joe, agree on the fundamental merits of us remaining within the European. But I disagree with you with the suggestion that somehow that is a complex thing. I don't think it is a complex thing to say that in a globalised world where there's a whole bunch of things we can't possibly deal with on our own, whether it's climate change, whether it's dealing with terrorism, whether it's dealing with cross-border crime, whether it's dealing with international trade, that you just get more done. You're stronger, you're safer if you do stuff together than if you turn your back on the outside world. By the way, it's exactly the same argument, Joe, that we're making about why Scotland should remain part of the family of nations in the United Kingdom, because we believe that Scotland can retain and indeed deepen its own identity as a nation within the United Kingdom, but that we just get a whole lot of stuff done together that we couldn't possibly do on our own. It's exactly the same argument in terms of Europe working together. And so I don't think it's that complex, but I agree with you that it needs to be made and remade, and I certainly agree with you, which is why I made the point yesterday that for Nigel Farage, not Nick Farage, Nigel Farage to sort of strut his stuff saying he's standing up for Britain and then not actually to bother to vote in favour of of things that would help Britain in the European Parliament. I just think it's important sometimes to expose the gap between what UKIP says and what it fails to do.
Before we move on,
yes,
Mr. Farage had this response for you,
did.
Mr. Clegg.
Before referee Ferrari has even rung the bell, he's thrown a punch. Well, OK, fair enough. If that's how you want it, Nick, here it is. I lead a national political party, and for me to vote, I have to get to Strasbourg, which is 8 hours away from home. And I voted 45% of the time whilst I've been leader of UKIP. You, by contrast, live in London, and yes, you're Deputy Prime Minister, but you've only voted 22% of the time since 2010. And I've dug back further, Nick. Between 2005 and 10, when you were an MP, and for part of that time leader of the Lib Dems, you only voted 42% of the time, despite the fact Westminster's just down the road. So really, I don't think you've picked the right battle here, old son.
Mr. Clegg. Old son.
See, we're measuring up to each other already before we've even stepped into the ring. Look, firstly, to compare like for like, when I was an MEP, in other words, when I was doing what Nigel Farage is now doing,
yes,
I tell you, I voted a lot more than he did. A lot more than he did.
Let's talk about the figures he quotes.
No, because let's compare like with like. He's an MEP, I was an MEP. When I did his job, I voted far more times.
You weren't leading a national party, is what Mr. Farage
No, I'm now Deputy Prime Minister, by the way. I'm in government. But listen, can I just... The key thing, though, is...
22% plays 45%, it would appear,
No,
Mr. Clegg.
when Nigel Farage and his fellow UKIP MEPs have the opportunity, for instance, to vote to bring down the costs of our mobile phone calls. Did they do it? No, they voted against it. When they had the opportunity to vote for an extradition treaty which keeps us safe, which, for instance, has helped extradite the one of the failed London bombers who threatened to kill and maim many people. Did they do it? No, they voted against it. When they had the opportunity to vote for a trade deal with the United States, with our partners in the United States, nothing to do with more European stuff, actually more kind of transatlantic stuff that you thought he would like, they didn't. They sat on their hands. So I just think when it comes to jobs, when it comes to safety, when it comes to cost of living,
you haven't addressed 22% plays 45%.
I have. I think if you
live in London, he lives. That's the point that he would make.
Yes.
And he has to lead a national party and go to vote in Europe.
And the point I would make is that when I was an MEP, I voted far.
In London is what he's saying. Since 2010, just to really nail that, why have you only voted 22% of the time?
Because I'm a Deputy Prime Minister of government. It's not unsurprising at all. In fact, this is invariably the case that senior politicians in senior positions in government don't vote as much as others do. But as I say, when I was doing Nigel Farage's job, I voted a lot more, and I certainly wouldn't have done what he's done, which is not lift a finger to help create British jobs by creating a free trade agreement with America, not lift a finger to help cut people's mobile phone costs, not lift a finger to actually help go after nasty criminals by signing up to the extradition treaty. So I just think it's really important that if you're going to say, as Nigel says, or Nick, as other people call him, that you're standing up for Britain, that you actually do what you say.
Right. Hashtag LBC First Europe debate.
Yes, looking forward to that.
And absolutely, we are all looking forward. Let's move on to our next call.
Elizabeth in Birmingham. Hello, Elizabeth.
Oh, good morning, Mr. Clegg. I hope you're well today, and Nick, too, the other Nick,
Thank you, I am.
My question to you is this. I read it in the Metro on Monday. Boris Johnson has claimed that Muslim children at risk of radicalisation from their parents should be taken into care. Would you like to discuss that?
Are you aware of the report?
I've heard him. I've heard that he's. I've also, by the way, I've heard that Boris Johnson now is in support of a mansion tax, having sort of poo-pooed it for many, many years. But anyway, there you go. He doesn't half say one thing.
Has
one
he
moment
actually said
another.
he supports your mansion tax?
Well, he doesn't call it a mansion tax, but he calls it extra council tax bans for very high-value properties in London, which is basically the mansion tax. And by the way, it's also precisely the proposal I put to George Osborne and David Cameron a couple of years ago, because it's a fair thing to do. I know, Elizabeth. Sorry, I was just asked about it. Sorry, I'll come back.
That's
Elizabeth,
my fault. That's my fault, Elizabeth.
Time to think.
All right,
sorry,
Mr.
Elizabeth. I was just because since that is quite an
My
important
fault.
issue. It was precisely the proposal that I put that the Conservatives wouldn't accept a couple of years ago. But back to your point, Elizabeth. I would really need to understand how one would adjudicate when a child is at risk. I think it would be
local schools. He was sitting in that very seat on Monday. Schools, local authorities, schools and churches and mosques and others, because also children of far-right families as well, if they were being inculcated with hateful views about black people or Jewish people.
Yeah, and look, it's an incredibly sensitive area, Elizabeth, about at what point does the state, do public authorities basically insert themselves into a family and say, you, mum and dad, this family is no longer fit to bring up your son and daughter as you wish. Now, that is a very, very big step to take. That is, that's one of the most extreme measures that the state can take to kind of actually basically break up a family.
So you don't agree with Boris?
No, what I'm saying is, so therefore, the circumstances in which that happens needs to be done where it is absolutely clear that it is indispensable to the safety of a child, which is what
So it could be okay.
Well, I am very uneasy about the idea that we start intervening when we think that the views of mum and dad somehow should no longer be communicated to a son.
Hang on, so it is a bad idea. It seems to be going both ways. It's probably my fault. I'm sorry. I haven't had a lot of sleep. Is it a bad idea?
You should sleep more.
I should indeed.
Because what I said is pretty straightforward.
So
if you're going to intervene, no, I think it is a very, very difficult idea.
It's a bad idea.
Well, if I can just choose my own words for 1 second, I think it is an extremely difficult idea to implement, for anyone to decide at what point the views, because that's what this is.
Yep.
This is safeguarding of children, Elizabeth. The point at which authorities normally intervene to remove a child from their own home is when they feel that there is a threat to their health, to their well-being, or to their life. Now, this is something saying quite different. Saying if you don't like the views of somebody of mum or dad, we are going to intervene to stop those views being communicated to their sons or their daughters. I'm very uneasy about that indeed.
Okay, so in certain instances.
I have not yet come across an instance where it would be easy for any government or any local authority or any child protection officer to say, because we don't like your views, we're now going to break up your family.
Never.
Well, I haven't come across.
Okay.
I mean, if you can tell me how on earth you could legislate for a way in which we wouldn't then be spending hour after hour on these programmes in future saying, well, hang on a minute, why is the state intervening because they don't like my views about immigration or they don't like my views about religion?
Yeah.
Well, it's I don't.
If I was informed by a school or a mosque that we had another Michael Adabavali on the way, I could see the merits.
Well, then, of course, you need to combat extremism and extreme views.
He was one of the killers of Lee Rigby.
But what Boris Johnson seems to be implying is that you basically break up families because you don't like the views that are being communicated within the home. Uh-huh. And as an old-fashioned liberal, you don't be surprised that I think that is a pretty slippery slope.
Elizabeth, thank you. I need to get an email question. And Pauline in Caterham, do you agree with Vince Cable? Teachers know nothing about working for a living. This is a little clip of a speech that Dr. Cable gave.
The line problem is, of course, that most teachers, particularly in the secondary sector, are graduates. They know how universities work, they know what you have to do to get an A-level, they know about UCAS forms, they know absolutely nothing about the world of work.
Applause there at a meeting with UK manufacturers. Nick Clegg.
Well, I don't think. I know for a fact that Vince is a huge admirer of the extraordinary work that our teachers do day in, day out. It was absolutely not his intention to cause offence. Teachers are the lifeblood of society. In fact, we just talked about the importance of adults, both in and outside the home, setting the right kind of example for our children. And
why did he say it then?
Well, I think he was having a wider discussion, which, by the way, in my experience, my friends and people I know who are in teaching actually agree with the wider point he was actually making, which was that we need to improve the careers advice and guidance that is given to kids in school, because frankly, in many schools, it's not yet good enough. And that's why I announced, for instance, last week that we're going to be issuing shortly guidance to schools about how to provide better careers advice and guidance, including, which is very relevant to the discussion Vince was having with that particular audience, including a new responsibility on schools to work with local employers and local businesses in order to give kids more of an opportunity to...
saying, though, is it? They know absolutely nothing about the world of work. It's hardly surprising the NUT, National Union of Teachers, describe his comments as, quotes, crass. They are crass, aren't they?
Well, if you take that sentence out of context and don't explain the context as I've done, of course I understand that teachers may be offended by that, but I also know that Vince did not intend to offend teachers. He was making a point about how we need to give youngsters and indeed teachers more support, as we will be doing shortly because of the announcement I made last week, support in making the decisions about what careers they might take up later.
Yeah, but anybody, if I was to say to you, and I wouldn't, you know absolutely nothing about the world of politics, or you would say to me, I would know absolutely nothing about the world.
You probably had said that about me on occasion. I might go over my records.
I write occasionally in the Sunday Express about the world of broadcasting. You know what the spirit is behind that. It's offensive, isn't it, Mr. Clegg?
As I say, I don't think... I know that Vince would not have wanted to cause offence. I am a massive... self-evidently a massive admirer of what teachers do day in, day out for millions
Are you a massive
of
admirer of Dr. Cable?
Well, I agree with the context in which that discussion was held, as I understand it, which is how do we make sure that children get better information, better support, better guidance, so they can decide for themselves what they want to do later in life. At the moment, frankly, the provision of careers advice and guidance across our schools, and teachers would agree with this, is too patchy. We're going to improve that in the way that I announced last week.
When things like this happen, as the leader, do you ring these blokes up and say, have you gone bloody bonkers?
Do you know, I treat adults as adults, and sometimes, and I've no doubt done it myself, sometimes you say something which you either wish you hadn't quite used those words, or they've been taken out of context, and you've just got to explain yourself, as I'm sure Vince will, and I know, when he does, that he will confirm that he didn't mean to cause any offence towards teachers whatsoever. Thomas in Wigan.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning, Mr. Clegg.
Hello.
What do you mean by cabinet collective responsibility? What does it mean to you? And do you think that you've been good partners in the coalition?
I think it's been remarkable. I think it's been a remarkable display of collective decision making by two parties that are clearly different and don't agree on everything.
For instance, did you clear the upcoming debate with Nigel Farage? Did you clear that with your government partners?
Well, of course not. It's not a government decision. It's got nothing to do with the Conservatives or the government.
You see, this is all the time you seem to be undermining it, and I hope to tell you...
No, sorry, Thomas. It's a completely ludicrous suggestion that I, as leader of the Liberal Democrats, cannot decide who I debate with as leader of the Liberal Democrats. It's got nothing to do with the government. It's got nothing to do with cabinet discussion. As it happens, myself and my coalition partners, the Conservatives, we don't see eye to eye on Europe, but that doesn't mean that we don't take decisions day in, day out, collectively, for the benefit of the country. David Cameron, myself, Danny Alexander and George Osborne spent hours yesterday, for instance, preparing the forthcoming budget together. But there are decisions that David Cameron takes that I would never dream of suggesting that he needs to talk to me about first, because he has every right to act as a leader of a party, as I do as well.
One thing that I think will be made clear at the next election, whichever party wins, and if it, either the Conservatives or the Labour, and I hope it's Labour, if they have they don't have an overall majority, I don't think either party would go into coalition with you because of the way you've behaved.
Well, I couldn't disagree more strongly with you. And I would warn you against the, how can I put it politely, the hubris of somehow suggesting that the two other parties, if they don't get a majority from the British people, can nonetheless somehow dictate to the rest of the country how the country will be governed. In a democracy, if you don't secure a majority for yourself in Parliament, you don't have the right to simply decide that you're going to govern the country nonetheless. And I think, I think we were faced as a country back in 2010 with an unprecedented situation. Firstly, an economic crisis caused largely by the party you support, the Labour Party, and secondly, an inconclusive outcome of the general election. What we did was novel, clearly not welcome to you, but I think was nonetheless absolutely indispensable in putting the country back on the straight and narrow, pulling the country back from the economic brink, which is where Labour had left it. And we're now finally seeing that the plan we started there as a coalition of rescuing, repairing and reforming the British economy is working.
Is it fair to say, Mr. Clegg, that the nation seems to be falling more in love with the idea of a coalition? A newspaper this week published that 34% of people believe, that's a third effectively, Britain is better off with a coalition government than if the Tories had won or Labour had won at the last general election. And apparently you're telling your Lib Dem colleagues to prepare for another 5 years in power in another form of coalition.
I think, look, my own view, people will agree or disagree. Thomas, who just rang, clearly is one of those people who strongly disagrees. But look, my own view is that one of the worst things for this country after the elections, the general election next year, would be a Conservative-only or a Labour-only government. Because I think a Labour-only government, the Labour Party has still not apologised for the mess they created. They would still, I think, jeopardise the economic recovery, which we need to nurture over the coming years. And the Conservatives certainly, and I've certainly learnt this having been in government for 4 years, are not committed to fairness in a way that we are. So if you want both to help secure the recovery but do it as fairly as you can, I think it's best to have Liberal Democrats around the cabinet table. Obviously, I would think that. There are some people like Thomas before who want want to somehow suggest that we go back to the Tweedledee, Tweedledum politics of the past, the red team, the blue team, and they even now suggesting, as Thomas did, that even if they don't win a majority, they should return to Tweedledee, Tweedledum politics. I think that's rather undemocratic. But anyway, we'll see what the British people have to say. At the end of the day, it's not what I think, or what even Thomas thinks, or what the politicians think. It's what millions of voters will decide for themselves come next May. Right. Joe in Peckham.
Oh, hi, Nick. It's International Women's Day on Saturday, as you know, and I wonder if you agree with me that Paddy Power's, the proceeds of the bets that Paddy Power have caused to be made because of their Oscar Pistorius ad, I wonder whether you agree with me that they should donate the proceeds of those bets to violence against women organisations.
This is the advertising. Just to remind everybody, the listeners, the Advertising Standards Authority has ordered Paddy Power, the bookmaker, to withdraw its Oscar Pistorius advert with immediate effect. More than 5,000 people have complained about the ad. The ad, effectively, you can get your money back if the athlete is found not guilty of murder. Mr. Clegg.
I mean, Joe, forgive me, I haven't actually followed this thing about the ad from Paddy Power. It's the first I've heard about it, so sorry to...
So they mocked up an Oscar, an Academy Award with Oscar Pistorius' face on the top of it, and they said it's Oscar time, and if he was acquitted of murder, then you'd get any money that you bet on the outcome of the trial back.
Well, I think that's pretty distasteful, to put it mildly. And if Paddy Power or indeed anybody else were to give a contribution, as you say, to charities and organisations that help to protect women against violence, that it would be, of course, a very good thing to do, regardless, frankly, of this advertisement or not. Because as you saw maybe yesterday or the day before, these very distressing statistics. I know statistics can sometimes be sliced and diced in different ways, but still, the statistics suggested that the levels of violence against women in Britain are some of the worst anywhere in Europe, and that is just abhorrent. I mean, the violence against women, and this is why, for instance, we as a government, as you maybe know, Joe, have been supporting these advertising campaigns to particularly explain to boys, and it is often boys, that when consensual sex means consensual sex. If a girl says no, it means no. And I'm afraid it's been quite shocking, I think, to many people to realise you have to explain that over and over and over again. And there are far too many, not always, but invariably boys who act as if they kind of just don't know the basic rules of what consent means. And I just think it is something we need to take out of the shadows. I think it's something we do need to talk about. I think it's something we need to tackle. And I strongly agree, Joe, with your wider instinct that where we can support those organisations that help to protect women against the violence that they might otherwise suffer, we should seek to do so.
Another email, if I may, Mr. Clegg. This comes from Pierre in Kent. As your cabinet colleague James Brokenshire is blaming a wealthy metropolitan elite of middle-class households for employing people from overseas, can I ask where your gardener and your children's nanny and your housekeeper are from?
I'm not going to get into a great list of who.
Do you employ staff from overseas? I think is the heart of.
I have a lady who has a Belgian passport who helps us. But if you don't mind, I'm not going to make my own domestic arrangements. But can I just say a wider point, because there's a lot in the papers quite rightly.
Is this about the rift? Vince Cable and Theresa May fighting the rifting coalition over Tory immigration scare stories. Your colleague, Mr. Cable, saying that we need more people to come in and power the economy, and the Conservative Party saying we need to restrict the numbers. Who's right, Mr. Clegg?
I think Vince is right in saying you've got to base this very difficult, emotive debate on facts and not on myths. He is not advocating unlimited immigration. Of course not. Neither would I, ever. And we have every right as a country, by the way, to kind of decide who comes in and out of our country as a sovereign nation. By the way, I remain very frustrated that the Home Office and Conservatives in the Home Office are not moving as quickly as they should do to reintroduce exit checks, which is something I personally insisted was in the coalition agreement of this government, so we know who leaves.
Why are they blocking you?
You need to talk to them. My conversations. Well, I think, to be honest, my own view is the Conservative Party have this self-declared objective of sort of a numerical target of net immigration.
100,000. How attainable is that?
Well, I've always said to them the problem is it's a target over which they don't have full control, because it depends partly on how many people leave this country, how many Brits leave this country. Actually, the number of Brits leaving this country is now at its lowest level it's been for many, many years. So you can't control it. You can't tell a number of Brits to leave this country in order to meet those targets. It'd just be absurd. So, that's why it's not a government target, but I think they've become very, very preoccupied with that. And I've always said to them, look, there are certain things we've got to do. Bear down on illegal immigration, bear down on abuses in the system, bear down on unscrupulous employers, reintroduce exit checks. These are things we can do to restore confidence in, and it is tattered and battered public confidence in the way the immigration system is run. But, and here was Vince's point, at the same time acknowledge that it is a two-way street. So, for instance, the number of EU people, people from elsewhere in Europe working in Britain is about exactly the same as the number of Brits living elsewhere in Europe. And 9 out of 10 jobs created last year in our economy were for British people. And, our NHS would collapse overnight if we didn't have people coming out from elsewhere.
So do you think there's fudging of figures by the Conservatives then?
What do you mean?
Are they in some way fudging the figures? They're trying to make it look that the people who aren't going out equals the same number that are coming in.
No, I'm just saying, if you look, you've got to talk to the Conservative Party about this. I've always disagreed, and that's why it's not a coalition government thing to pursue a net migration. Even Liam Fox now agrees with me that pursuing a net migration figure when you don't have full control about how you deliver that, is obviously a pretty perilous thing to do.
Even Liam Fox, that's a little unfair. We finish with one more email question. Does Nick Clegg agree with what's happened in Denmark and that the practice of halal and kosher should be banned in the UK?
No,
this is also...
I do not. I emphatically do not agree with what they've done in Denmark, and no government of which I'm a part will follow suit. Of course, I want to see animal suffering minimised. Everybody does. Where they can be,
the British Veterinary Association.
Well,
I'm sorry to interrupt.
I disagree with him. I disagree with his suggestion that we basically remove the right of Jewish communities in this country, Muslim communities in this country, to stick to their religious beliefs about how they prepare food and how animals are slaughtered.
But animals have caused unnecessary suffering, he would argue.
Well,
Mr.
as I say, we should try and minimise that. Where they can be stunned, they should be stunned. But I'm not going to ever advocate that we remove the deeply held beliefs amongst members of our Jewish community and Muslim communities about, and these are ancient beliefs handed down over generations, that somehow we should now, as they have done in Denmark, prohibit them from following their practices and their beliefs. I just don't, as a liberal, I believe in trying to protect that kind of diversity, not trying to squash it.
It's a mark of your popularity. The switchboard is absolutely jammed, but we've come to the end of another
we'll have to extend this.
We're always up for that, I assure you. Don't go tempting me. Nick Clegg, thank you very much indeed. Cool. Clegg, of course, will return same time next week here on LBC.
A new D-Day has dawned for Europe. Debate Day. On March 26, when LBC will exclusively host the big Euro debate. Lib Dem leader and Deputy Prime Minister